In Luke chapter 16, verses 19 through 31, we read the familiar parable of Lazarus and the rich man. Some people use this parable to say that people go to heaven or hell immediately at death. But others know that a parable is a fictitious story that is bringing home a principle or a moral lesson. Let's get into the parable of Lazarus and the rich man to understand what is really going on in this particular parable. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Truth Unveiled. Our subject for today is the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. Some believe that this is a true story, that Lazarus was a real person, and it's talking about what happens immediately after death. That some people either go to heavenly bliss or some people go to fire and eternal torment. But others say that this is merely a parable, a fictitious story that is teaching us a religious principle or moral lesson. So which is it? We're going to look at that today. Now, when we talk about this parable of Lazarus and the rich man, it's found in Luke chapter 16, verses 19 through 31. Many people say that it is a parable, and we need to understand what a parable is. It is nothing more than a fictitious story that is using things that are familiar to people to try to bring home a moral lesson or a religious principle. Now, when Jesus was telling this story, the Pharisees used very similar stories like Lazarus and the rich man. In my research, I found that there were up to 7 similar type stories, similar to this story of Lazarus and the rich man, that were used by the Pharisees. Now, that's an important thing to recognize also, that the Pharisees used these types of teaching tools, because in the book of Luke, Jesus is using a number of parables, I believe, to stick it to the Pharisees, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later as we move on, so you can get a better understanding of this particular parable. Now, those who argue that this is dealing with the state of the dead, they would say, why would Jesus make up a story about something like that? But you can look in many other parables. In fact, in chapter 16 of Luke, there is a parable at the beginning of that chapter that deals with an unscrupulous businessman, a corrupt businessman who is taking away some of the funds of his master. And Jesus talks about the fact that it's important that this person had friendships in his life so he could be taken care of, but he's going to be taking care of people who he used against his boss. So again, is Jesus telling that story to promote the idea of unscrupulous businessmen? No, not at all. He's just using that story to give a fuller meaning about something, and he uses the unscrupulous businessman as a foil within the story, that this is just someone in a fictitious story so I can get at a moral lesson that you need to understand. The same thing is being done in the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. Jesus did not believe that people immediately went to bliss or went to torment as soon as they died. That is not in the Old Testament. That is not in the teachings that Jesus would have been familiar with, and I'm going to show you that here momentarily. When we look at the Old Testament and see what the Bible teaches about the state of the dead, obviously it is not that people are consciously aware as soon as they die. Now, In the judgment period, some people are going to get eternal life, going to have that with Abraham. Some people are going to be destroyed through a fire, but that is not going to happen until Jesus comes back to this earth, sets up his kingdom, and then we get to a final judgment in the future. But notice what the Old Testament does say about the state of the dead. I'm going to go back to Genesis, the first book in the Bible. That's a good place to start. And you see the same idea throughout the Old Testament. Genesis chapter 3 and verse 19 says this: "In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground. For out of it wast thou taken. For dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return." So that's pretty plain. You return to the dust, okay? If you went to a heavenly bliss, if you went to a burning hellfire, don't you think we would have that here when it's talking about death? Let me give you some more examples. Let's turn over to Psalm 104. So another part of the Bible, a different writer wrote this particular section of Scripture. And notice it's the same story. Psalm 104 and verse 29. "Thou hidest thy face, they are troubled. Thou takest away their breath, they die, and return to their dust." Where do they return to? The dust, the ground, the grave. They don't go to Abraham's bosom. They don't go to a place where there are flames of fire. That's what happens when you die. You return to the dust. You are unconscious. You sleep. Ecclesiastes, yet another writer in the Old Testament, but the same idea. Ecclesiastes chapter 9 and verse 5. Notice what it says: "For the living know that they will die, but the dead know not anything, neither have they any more a reward, for the memory of them is forgotten." Dropping down to verse 10 of Ecclesiastes 9. "Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy might, for there is no work, nor device, nor knowledge, nor wisdom in the grave whither thou goest." Again, this is pretty plain, folks. Nothing going on when you're dead, okay? You're unconscious. You're asleep. You want some more evidence? Let's go to 1 Kings chapter 2 and verse 10. 1 Kings chapter 2 and verse 10. Listen to what it says. David is about to die. "So David slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David." Throughout 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, whenever a king of Israel or Judah dies, what does it say? They slept with their fathers. They rested with their fathers. You will find another phrase in the Old Testament that talks about being gathered to their people. And why did they use that phrase? Because they buried people in caves, or they buried them under their homes. And when you were gathered to your people, you went where all the other bones were of your dead relatives. That's what meant being gathered to your people was. That's what was meant by sleeping with your fathers or resting with your fathers. When you were dead, you were unconscious, you were unaware, you could not do anything. The Bible is clear that there is a future resurrection for the righteous when Jesus returns, and then there's another resurrection at the end of the 1,000-year millennium when Jesus will judge the rest of humanity, but he's also going to teach them his truth. But that is for another show. Let me continue on this idea of what happens when we die. And let's think about that concept of burning in a fire like the rich man was suffering under in that fictitious story, in that parable. When we go to Malachi chapter 4, notice what it says here in Malachi 4. Oh yeah, there's going to be a destruction of the wicked by fire, but it is going to burn them up and leave them nothing. They are not going to be conscious. In Malachi 4 verse 1, "For behold, the day cometh that shall burn as an oven, and all the proud, yea, and all that do wickedly shall be stubble. And the day cometh that shall burn them up, saith the Lord of hosts, that it shall leave them neither root nor branch. But unto you that fear my name shall the Son of Righteousness arise with healing in his wings, and you will go forth and grow up as calves of the stall. So again, those who are going to be like what Abraham gets, it's going to be good for them. Those who are going to get what the rich man gets, it's going to leave them nothing. They're going to be destroyed. Verse 3, and you will tread down the wicked, for they will be ashes under the soles of your feet in the day that I will do this, saith the Lord of hosts. Remember you the law of Moses my servant, which I commanded unto him in Horeb, for all Israel, with the statutes and judgments. So isn't that interesting? After telling him what's going to happen to the wicked, he says, remember the law of Moses and everything I taught Moses. That's very interesting, because he says the same thing in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, that even if someone came back from the dead, that it's not going to do anything for them. What they got to do is hold on to the law of Moses and the prophets, okay? Because that's the truth. The holy scriptures of God are the truth. And now that we have the New Testament, we know we've got to follow the example of Jesus, who followed his Father's law and kept his commandments. So that is what is important here in this parable of Lazarus and the rich man, doing what you're supposed to do, because obviously the rich man was not doing it. He was full of what was important in the world, having riches, being above other people, not even able to give Lazarus a real meal. Lazarus had to take the crumbs from the table of that rich man. And so that parable of Lazarus and the rich man is trying to bring home a point to us. It's a warning against greed and a lack of love for others. That is the moral lesson that we get out of that story. But there's even more to that story that I want to clue you in on. So when we go back to Luke 16, I want to read a few verses here in Lazarus and the rich man. Notice verse 19, Luke 16. There was a certain rich man which was clothed in purple and fine linen, and fared sumptuously every day. Now, purple, that's an interesting color. Again, you had to be rich in order to get the color purple in your material. But did you know that the high priest of Israel had purple in his materials of his vestments? That's an important thing I want you to note and keep that in mind. I believe Jesus is sticking it to the Pharisees by telling them this story because of what's going to happen in his own ministry. And let me show you some evidence that Jesus was against the Pharisees and he was teaching against some of the things they taught. Notice Luke 16 verse 14, just a few verses before the parable in question. And the Pharisees also, who were covetous, heard all these things, and they derided him. So Jesus has some tension here with the Pharisees right before he gives the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Could the rich man be a symbol also of the Pharisees, because the high priest who was involved with the Pharisees would wear purple in his garments also? Keep that thought in mind, and let me drop back to chapter 15 of Luke. Again, notice what comes right before this parable of Lazarus and the rich man. Luke 15 verse 2. And the Pharisees and scribes murmured, saying, This man receives sinners and eateth with them. And he spake this parable unto them, saying. So Jesus, he knows what the Pharisees are saying against them, and he's going to use a parable against them here in chapter 15 of Luke. Now let's drop over to Luke 14 and verse 1. And it came to pass, as he went into the house of one of the chief Pharisees to eat bread on the Sabbath day, that they watched him. And what's going to happen here in verse 3? Let's pick it up. And Jesus answering spake unto the lawyers and Pharisees, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath day? So again, they had all these rules and regulations about how you had to observe the Sabbath. Jesus is coming to say, hey, I'm the one who created this law. I can tell you what the written law really meant, because they had created an oral law around the written law, and Jesus was speaking against that in many places in the gospel accounts, against the Pharisaical teaching and their oral law. Drop back to chapter 13 of Luke. Let's pick it up in verse 31. The same day there came certain of the Pharisees, saying unto him, Get thee out and depart hence, for Herod will kill thee. And he said unto them, Go ye and tell that fox, Behold, I cast out devils, and I do cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I shall be perfected. Again, showing this tension in the relationship between Jesus and the Pharisees. Over and over and over we see it. Let's go back another chapter, chapter 12, verse 1. In the meantime, when there were gathered together an innumerable multitude of people, insomuch that they trod one upon another, he began to say unto his disciples, First of all, beware you of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. Wow, he's laying it on the Pharisees there, isn't he? And then let's go back to Luke 11, picking it up in verse 37. And as he spake, a certain Pharisee besought him to dine with him, and he went in and sat down to meat. But drop down to verse 42 of Luke 11. But woe unto you, Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and all manner of herbs, and pass over judgment and the love of God. These ought you to have done, and not to leave the other undone. So the Pharisees were missing the love of God. And you get that as you go through Luke 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, up to Luke 16. He's dealing with the Pharisees and all these interactions. And also in Luke 16, right before the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, we have the Pharisees mentioned again. But notice what it said back here in Luke 11, that the Pharisees were missing the love of God. And what comes up in that parable of Lazarus and the rich man? The rich man is missing the love of God, not taking care of this poor beggar named Lazarus. Now, there's a big ending here in the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. Let me read it to you. So again, Lazarus is with Abraham in his bosom. The rich man is in this place of torment. There's a gulf between them. They cannot come in between and connect because of this gulf between them. Notice what it says in verse 27 of Luke 16. Then he said, I pray thee therefore, Father, this is the rich man speaking to Abraham, that thou wouldest send him to my father's house. Send who? Send Lazarus. Send a guy back from the dead. Verse 28, for I have 5 brothers, that he may testify unto them, lest they also come into this place of torment. Abraham said unto him, They have Moses and the prophets. Remember what Malachi said about the wicked. What did he say right after what was going to happen to the wicked? That read Moses in the law, follow Moses and what he says. Same lesson here. Abraham said, They have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. And he said, Nay, Father Abraham, but if one went to them from the dead, they will repent. And he said unto him, If they hear not Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded, though one rose from the dead. So even if Lazarus went back from the dead to tell them the story, it would not do anything. It would not help them. They've got to follow Moses and the prophets. And they told about the coming Messiah and all of that. Now, check this out over in the book of John. John chapter 11. I want to wind this down by telling you a little bit more about this parable. Was Jesus really sticking it to the Pharisees with this parable? Watch this. John chapter 11. Let me pick it up there in verse 43. And when he thus had spoken, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. And he that was dead came forth, bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was bound about with a napkin. Jesus saith unto them, Loose him, and let him go. Then many of the Jews which came to Mary and had seen the things which Jesus did believed on him. But some of them went their way to the Pharisees. Ding, ding, ding. They went to the Pharisees and told them what things Jesus had done. Well, what did Jesus just do? He just raised a guy named Lazarus, ding, 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 from the dead. And what do the Pharisees do with that information? A guy named Lazarus has come back from the dead. Remember the parable. What did Abraham say? Even if somebody comes back from the dead, these people aren't going to get it. They got to follow Moses and the prophets. And who followed Moses and the prophets more than anybody else at this time? Who knew the law better than anybody else? The Pharisees. Yet they weren't understanding the love of God truly. And Jesus derailed them for that. Notice now what happens here. They tell this story of Lazarus coming back from the dead to the Pharisees. And how do the Pharisees react? Verse 44 of John 11. And he that was dead came let me drop down now to verse 45. Then many of the Jews which came to Mary and had seen the things which Jesus did believed on him. But some of them went their way to the Pharisees and told them what things Jesus had done. Then gathered the chief priests and the Pharisees a council and said, What do we, for this man doeth many miracles? If we let him thus alone, all men will believe on him, and the Romans shall come and take away our place and nation. What did the rich man want? He liked his sumptuous life. He liked his position. He couldn't even think about that poor Lazarus beggar. Verse 49, and one of them named Caiaphas, being the high priest. He's got purple in his vestments, folks. Okay? That same year said unto them, Ye know nothing at all, nor consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation perish not. Verse 51, and this spake he not of himself, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus should die for that nation. Wow. Do you get this connection between the parable of Lazarus and the rich man and Jesus' miracle of raising Lazarus from the dead? That's why I believe this particular individual in only this parable is named Lazarus, unlike any other parable where they're not named. He names him Lazarus in this parable as a final sticking it to the Pharisees and showing people that they did not get it. They were not understanding what Jesus was doing and what he was all about. Hopefully you do. Now, I want you to get more information on the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. Listen to this.
Hi, we would like to offer some free study materials that will help you examine the question we addressed today. We would like you to read the booklet, Lazarus and the Rich Man, Where Are They? You can find this booklet by visiting cgi.org, visiting the literature section of the website and search under the subtopic Apologetics. We would also like you to listen to the sermon, Lazarus and the Pharisees, by Vance Stinson. You can find it by visiting cgi.org and visiting the sermon section of the website and searching for the title of the message. If you live in Los Angeles, California and would like to attend church with today's presenter Mike James, visit cgila.org for more information. Thanks again for watching Truth Unveiled.